The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was dry, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush as it whipped across the New Mexican desert. I'd lived in the area for most of my life, but I never tired of these sunsets. There was something ancient, almost sacred, about the way the light played over the barren land, illuminating the secrets hidden within the desert's depths. My name is Tom. I'd moved back to New Mexico a few years ago after spending most of my 20s and early 30s in the bustling chaos of Los Angeles. I'd had enough of the noise, the traffic, and the constant hum of city life. The desert called to me, promising solitude, peace, and a chance to reconnect with my roots. My family had lived in these parts for generations, and I'd grown up hearing the old stories, tales of spirits, curses, and creatures that stalked the night. But those were just stories, right? I had settled into a small, remote cabin about 20 miles outside of Taos. The property was isolated, surrounded by miles of open desert, with nothing but the wind and the occasional coyote for company. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. During the day, I worked as a freelance writer, crafting articles and short stories from the comfort of my porch. At night, I'd sit outside, staring up at the stars, letting the silence of the desert seep into my bones. That was until the silence began to change. It started with the sounds, unfamiliar noises that didn't belong in the desert. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A rustling in the bushes, the crack of a branch that seemed too deliberate to be caused by the wind. But as the days passed, the noises grew louder, more persistent. Something was out there, watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination. Living out in the middle of nowhere can do that to a person. Your mind starts playing tricks on you, filling the quiet with phantom sounds. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. Something had changed in the desert, and it was getting closer. One night, as I sat on my porch, sipping a cold beer, I heard it again. A low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound didn't come from any animal I was familiar with. It was too deep, too menacing. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the door and shone it out into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the scrubby bushes and rocky outcrops that surrounded my cabin. But there was nothing there. The growling stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the whisper of the wind in its wake. Probably just a coyote, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I'd heard coyotes before, hell, I'd seen them plenty of times, and this wasn't the same. This was something else. The next few nights passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The desert, which had once felt so comforting in its isolation, now seemed hostile, alien. I kept my doors locked and my rifle close at hand, just in case. It wasn't until a week later that things took a turn for the worse. I was woken in the middle of the night by a noise that chilled me to the bone. A voice calling my name. Tom. The sound was soft, almost a whisper, but there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Tom. The voice came again, clearer this time. It was coming from outside, just beyond my window. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered out into the darkness, searching for the source of the voice. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the landscape, but I couldn't see anyone. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response, only the rustling of the wind through the sagebrush. I was about to turn away when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the property, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and its limbs were twisted at unnatural angles. Tom, the voice came again. But this time it was different, distorted, like it was being forced through a mouth that wasn't meant for speaking. I stumbled back from the window, my hands shaking as I clutched the rifle. This wasn't just some trespasser. This was something else, something I couldn't explain. The stories I'd heard as a child came flooding back to me, Stories of skinwalkers, shapeshifters, who could take on the form of animals, or even people. The old Navajo tales warned of these creatures, said they were witches who had committed unspeakable acts to gain their powers. I'd always dismissed them as just that. Stories. But now, staring at the thing outside my cabin, I wasn't so sure. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my room, the rifle in my lap, listening to the sounds outside. The voice called out to me a few more times, each time more insistent, more desperate, but I didn't respond. Eventually, as dawn approached, the voice faded, leaving only the silence of the desert behind. When the sun finally rose, I ventured outside, my rifle still in hand. There were no signs of the figure from the night before. No footprints or disturbed earth. But as I made my way around the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratch marks, deep and jagged, gouged into the wooden walls of my home. Whatever had been out there, it had been close, too close. I knew I couldn't stay here, not with that thing out there. But I also knew I couldn't just leave. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I wasn't about to let some supernatural creature drive me out. I spent the day preparing, checking my supplies, loading up on ammo, and securing the cabin as best I could. I didn't know if any of it would help, but I had to try. As the sun dipped below the horizon once again, I sat in the center of the cabin, my rifle ready, and waited. The night was long, the hours crawling by as I sat in the dark, listening. For a while there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the desert at night. But then, just as I was beginning to think that maybe it wouldn't come back, I heard it. The growling. It was louder this time, closer. I stood up, my hands gripping the rifle tightly as I scanned the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The growling grew louder, more intense, until it seemed to be coming from all around me, vibrating through the walls of the cabin. And then, without warning, the front door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the entire cabin. I raised the rifle, aiming it at the doorway, but what stepped through wasn't what I expected. It was a coyote, or at least it looked like one. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my stomach turn. Its eyes were too human, too intelligent, and its body was twisted, deformed. It stared at me, its lips curled back in a snarl, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then it lunged. I fired the rifle, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit the creature in the shoulder, but it didn't go down. Instead, it howled in pain, a sound that was almost human, and lunged at me again. I fired again, this time hitting it in the chest. The creature staggered, its growl turning into a gurgle as it collapsed to the floor. I stood over it, panting, my hands shaking as I watched it die. But as I looked closer, the horror of what I'd done hit me like a punch to the gut. The skinwalker was changing. Its fur receded, its limbs lengthening and twisting until it was no longer an animal lying at my feet, but a man. A man with weathered skin and dark eyes that stared up at me, filled with a mix of anger and pain. I stumbled back, dropping the rifle, as I realized who it was, one of the old Navajo men from the nearby reservation, a man I'd seen in town a few times but had never spoken to. I'd killed him, but it wasn't just a man lying there. It was something else, something that had been hunting me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been the prey all along, lured into a deadly game by a creature that wore the skin of a man. But I had fought back, and now it was over, or so I thought. As I stood there, staring at the lifeless body, I heard a noise behind me, a soft rustling followed by a low growl. I turned, my heart racing, and saw another figure standing in the doorway. This one was different, larger, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. It wasn't over. The skinwalker had called for help. I backed away, my mind racing as I tried to think of what to do. I could fight, but there was no guarantee I'd survive. I could run, but there was nowhere to go. The desert was vast, but it offered no sanctuary. The creature took a step forward, its lips pulling back in a grotesque imitation of a smile. I could see the hunger in its eyes, the desire to finish what it had started. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I wouldn't go down without a fight. The creature lunged and I fired the rifle, the sound echoing through the night. The bullet hit its mark, but the creature barely flinched. It was stronger, faster, more determined than the last one. I fired again and again, but it kept coming, its growls turning into a deafening roar as it closed the distance between us. In that moment, I realized the truth. I couldn't win. The skinwalkers were too strong, too powerful. They had been here long before I was, and they would remain long after I was gone. The desert belonged to them. But I wouldn't give up, not yet. I fought with everything I had, using the rifle as a club when the bullets ran out. But it wasn't enough. The creature was on me, its claws raking across my chest, its teeth sinking into my flesh. I screamed, the pain overwhelming, but I didn't stop fighting. I wouldn't let it take me without a struggle. But in the end, it didn't matter. The creature was too strong, too relentless. It tore into me with a ferocity I couldn't match, and I knew deep down that this was the end. As the darkness closed in, I thought of the desert, the place I had called home, the place that had drawn me back after years of running. I had come here seeking peace, but all I found was death. And as I took my last breath, the creature's growls filling my ears, I realized that the old stories were true. The skinwalkers were real, and they would continue to hunt to kill as long as the desert remained. And in the end, there was nothing I could do to stop them. Like and subscribe for more stories like this.